Hi, I'm Ann Rieselbach, the League's Program Director. Welcome to the opening night of lectures by this year's Architectural League Prize winners. On behalf of the League, I'd like to thank the League Prize Committee, Jose Amazurrutia, Jermaine Barnes, and Jennifer Bonner, all recent League Prize winners, for conceiving and elucidating this year's competition theme, Uncomfortable, and for their selection of additional jury members, Barbara Bester, Bonnie Ix, Kyle Miller, and Tai Nguyen, who along with the committee devoted considerable time to individually evaluating all of the entries and then collectively participating in a thoughtful jury session to select 6 winners from a truly outstanding group of finalists. Tonight brings the first pair of lectures by 2 of the 6 2023 League Prize winners. We hope that you can join us next week, June 22nd, and on the following Thursday, the 29th, to hear presentations by other winning firms, with all of the sessions introduced and moderated by members of the League Prize Committee. We also hope that you'll visit each of the winners' online installations, which launched this week on the League's website, and form part of what will be a collection of content available on artleague.org, including our firm profiles, the videos of these lectures, the installations, and interviews. I'd also like to draw your attention to a current League Instagram takeover by the winners. So if you're not following the League, please do. And then all of this online material was created with truly valuable advice and support by League staff members, Rafi Lehman, Alicia Botero, Sarah Wessler, and Ann Carlisle. Britt Cobb and Michael Beirut of Pentagram once again designed the program's competition graphics, including the just released and downloadable exhibition poster. This poster has a QR code that'll bring people directly to the League's website. So please, everyone on this in the audience, print out a copy and post 1 or 2 or all over posters. So it's another way of bringing people to the show. This entire program, from the competition to the installation, lectures, and related material, is made possible through the enthusiastic corporate sponsorship provided by Judlow, Tischler & Son, and Delta Millworks. And League programs are also made possible in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. Support is also provided by the Next Generation Fund, an alumni fund of the Architectural League's Emerging Voices and League Prize programs, and of the J. Clausen Mills Fund of the Architectural League, and through the commitment and support of the League's members and friends. Please check the League's website and sign up for our weekly newsletter to learn more about the League, including upcoming events and an extensive collection of online resources, such as videos and essays documenting past programs and also special projects. League Prize Committee member Jose Amazurrutia will introduce tonight's speakers. Jose received an MArch degree with honors from UNAM, where he was the recipient of the Abraham Zubodowski Thesis Prize and the Francisco D. Moza Award. He has continued his relationship with UNAM, shifting from student to educator, first as a thesis seminar professor, and then in 2016, being named as a design studio coordinator. Like many of his peers, Jose's practice is often collaborative. In 2015, he co-founded Toe Studio with Carlos Spaccio. 4 years later, he formed Colectivo C733 with Gabriela Carrillo, Carlos Spaccio, Eric Valdez, and Israel Espini. And last year, he helped form the El Gatpon Cultural Space. After the winners' presentations, Jose will join them in conversation and forward questions from all of you. So please post them in the Q&A session either throughout the lecture or immediately afterwards. And welcome.
Thank you so much, Anne. And well, first of all, I would like to thank you to Anne Rieselbach and all the team of the Architectural League of New York for inviting me to take part in this year's League Prize Committee. It was an honor and a true pleasure to come up with Uncomfortable, this year's theme, along with Jennifer Bonner and Jermaine Barnes, 2 marvelous and brilliant colleagues and fellow winners of this prize. It was also an honor to converse with the jury members, Barbara Bester, Kyle Miller, Taya Nguyen, and Wani Ix, and talking about the strong response we had from all participants. Secondly, I would like to say that I'm also truly thrilled to be presenting the work of Sarah Aziz and Lindsey Krug of Salk, and Miles Gertler, who shares practice with Igor Bragado of Common Accounts. I must say that both studios presented two of the strongest portfolios for a number of reasons, but particularly because they both structurally addressed the questions behind the uncomfortable times we live in. Having said this, I would like to briefly introduce Salk's and Common Accounts work, but before that, I will read to you the call for entries we made. This is an open call for a generation of designers in an age of the uncomfortable. Feeling awkward, nervous, or uneasy? As young designers, we are wrestling with numerous uncomfortable responsibilities, dismantling architectural legacies, challenging traditional paradigms, grappling with the costs of comfort, responding to ecological concerns. Our many discomforts range in scale, context, and urgency. The 2023 Architectural League Prize for Young Architects and Designers asks entrants to examine the uncomfortable. From climate change to labor practices, the sources of our discomfort demand both critical reflection and collective imagination. Are you restless within the discipline's status quo? How do you respond to discomfort? Whose comfort matters? We invite practices to demonstrate how they find comfort within the unconventional, discover opportunity within crisis, and use the uncomfortable as a design tool. As a personal reflection, I would like to say that after reviewing all entries with the jury and the committee, we realized that quite often architects become salesmen of themselves, and that may be uncomfortable. The work of Salk and Common Accounts, however, displayed a different angle towards architecture and design. Their portfolios are documents, public documents, I would say, containing meaningful questions about collective issues. Their work functions as a conveyor of unresolved conditions, seen from new angles, compelling its audience to question the way we inhabit this world. As we all know, questions are often more important than answers. A good answer comes necessarily from a good question. Questions open possibilities, while answers set limits. Architecture itself quite often sets cultural limits. On the other hand, installations and ephemeral architecture are means to challenge the boundaries of architecture itself, and more precisely, the built and digital environment that surround us. And I think this is something Salk and Common Accounts have in common. They use an artistic mindset and mix it in a blender with digital technologies and high quality graphic representation abilities to come up with strong questions and provocative answers. As we will see in their work, there can be many reasons for feeling uncomfortable today, as young architects, but also as citizens of this world. Some of them may seem mundane, but they are actually symptoms of a much larger issue. So before finishing this intro and talking about questions and answers, I would like to invite the audience and invite you to use the Q&A section to type questions and or commentaries for the two winners of this year 2023 League Prize. So with no more further to add, please let us welcome Miles Gertler first, and then Aziz and Lindsey Krug. Congratulations, guys, for being here tonight.
Many thanks for your introduction and your moderation tonight, Jose. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. My thanks as well to Anne and the team at the Architectural League of New York for bringing us together for this program of events. I'm thrilled to honestly have the opportunity to share the work that Igor and I do at Common Accounts alongside Sarah and Lindsey's, and I look forward to the discussion yet to come tonight. I'm joining from Italy, so forgive me if the time difference starts to take effect in the latter portion of tonight's program. I co-founded Common Accounts with Igor Bragado, who lives and works in Madrid, in 2016. Our practice is predicated on the uncomfortable reality that most design intelligence in the world operates, we think, below the radar of the design disciplines. Our work then is concerned with expanding architecture's scope to learn from the ingenuity abundant in the immediate present. So in this capacity, our studio tries to take an extra architectural approach to the situation, often looking only a few seconds into the future or into the rear view of the recent past. Our research often takes on live, unresolved conditions, so it's no surprise then that folks often approach our work with a kind of uneasy curiosity. And I would say that we counter that discomfort by leaning into it head on, which makes this year's League Prize theme uncomfortable, so resonant for us. In many ways, we're outliers in the disciplinary contexts where we practice, and we've always been tethered, I would say, more to networks of peers, politics, and file storage than we are to traditional notions of place and practice. The internet really is the ecosystem of common accounts, both in terms of the topics that we study, our connections to collaborators, and also the operational platforms that we rely on. Our practice has always operated remotely and with a kind of itinerant approach to context. We've always worked at a distance between cities like Toronto, New York, Madrid, and Seoul since our start 7 years ago. And maybe fittingly, our work is concerned with the design of spatial and technological protocols centering self-design and transformations of the human body that can in turn be adapted to specific contexts in both the digital and the IRL. The worlds we engage include cosmetic surgery, fitness, death care, and these might be challenging to confront, but we know that discomfort often points to opportunity. We're committed, I would say, to reversing the arm's length distancing of subjects like these from the everyday. And we know that taboos are often merely constructs and that renewed proximities to subjects like these can yield newfound forms of value for shared enjoyment. The basis of our work then, I would say, is to question, reorganize, and maybe intensify established realities for the improvement of daily life. And I think we could say that all of our work really belongs to one single project, which started with the inquiry, originated in our joint thesis, which we did at Princeton University, which focused on self-design and new models of funeral memorials and death infrastructures, which was called Closer Each Day, the Architecture of Everyday Death. The story really began with someone named John Berlin, or really his son, Jesse Berlin, who died unexpectedly in his sleep in 2012 at the age of 21. Soon after Jesse's death, his father, John Berlin, who's a middle-aged, maybe sort of out of shape, married father of 3 who lived in a mobile home in Arnold, Missouri, he started a YouTube channel and discovered the Insanity Physical Fitness program by the Santa Monica-based company Beachbody. The Berlin family home became a site of spatial and programmatic transformation that would host and also embody John's grief for his son. John turned to exercise to reverse the effects that a largely sedentary lifestyle had had on his body. And in 2013, he announced that he was taking on clients as a trainer from his living room, which was now outfitted with a memorial to his son, Jesse, on the space's back wall. And 2 years after his son's death, John posted his first viral content, in which he made a plea to Facebook for a look-back video of his dead son's account. The look-back video format is a slideshow of greatest hits from a user's virtual material, and it was a product of Facebook's 10th anniversary celebrations. And soon after its launch, and emotional John asked Facebook via YouTube to generate that video from the material that he didn't have access to on his son's Facebook account. After logging 2 million views in just 48 hours, John received a call from Mark Zuckerberg, granting his request and announcing an immediate review into Facebook's policies toward memorialization and the accounts of dead users. In the background of the plea video, Berlin's living room had been further transformed since we'd seen it first months prior. His son's memorial wall had been replaced by floor-to-ceiling mirrors, revealing some fitness equipment at the room's peripheries and the space's overall transformation into a home gym. Remote audiences made up of Insanity fitness buffs and trainees and other spectators had become participants in Berlin's mourning. And his Facebook profile and his comment feed really came to operate as a kind of platform for others to mourn the deaths of those close to them. And the living room really had become a gym in service of memorial and dying. Berlin's embrace of fitness really demonstrates the common ground occupied by the construction and deconstruction of the body in the public imaginary. This spills over into design thinking too. So the symmetry between technologies for self-construction, maintenance, and healing, and those serving death can be seen in the 19th century German architect and historian Gottfried Semper's description of the Egyptian labra in style in the technical and tectonic arts. He points to the shared typological origins of the bathtub and the sarcophagus, and of the urn and the canopic vase as ritual instruments for both hygiene and self-preservation, serving the living and the dead. Our own project, Closer Each Day, reproduced that reciprocity between healing and dying and embraced a range of scales of intervention that could respond to human anatomy and the domestic realm, and offer a cyclical, ecological model of many parts. We wanted to reverse the distancing of death from daily life in order to produce new forms of value. And in fact, we would probably argue that today's city can no longer really afford to keep the material business of death at arm's length. Today, new technologies kind of present opportunities for the production of value, be it material, ceremonial, and ecological value, that shouldn't be ignored, while traditional means of remains disposition really are threatened by diminishing land availability, environmental concerns, and also the prospect of your virtual afterlife. After all, the heat of the crematorium can warm your house. Fluid cremation allows you to fertilize a garden with your own liquid remains. And the prospect of a virtual afterlife demands that we confront death online. The way that we want our bodies to be treated and transformed after death, we would say, constitutes one of life's many rituals of self-design. In his 1993 book, The Virtual Community, Homesteading on the Electronic Frontier, the writer Howard Rheingold says that you aren't a community until you've held a funeral. And in the case of John Berlin, we observed how ad hoc mourning practices were beginning to occupy mixed realities in material and digital realms, but were often undesigned or awkwardly hosted by the interfaces of for-profit social platforms intended for the living. This demonstrated to us the urgency for new modes of memorial that could bridge the IRL with the online and manage both the virtual and material remains of the urban dead. And so this is what we channeled in our project 3 Ordinary Funerals, which was a prototype for a new kind of funeral home commissioned for the Seoul Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism in 2017 in Korea. 3 Ordinary Funerals was a response to the internet-enabled condition of authentic, simultaneous participation in diverse subcultures, both on and offline, something that's also been elaborated by others, like the now defunct trend forecasting group K-Hole. 3 Ordinary Funerals represented a single funeral for a single person and their 3 unique online avatars, enacted and developed by a Seoul-based collaborator named Dasul Han. And the funeral infrastructure plugged into a traditional Korean courtyard house, a hanok, as an apparatus for many simultaneous forms of memorial and to generate value, ecological, social, material, at the scale of the neighborhood from a renewed proximity to death. The project, which we developed with the curator Ji-Hui Lee, was equipped with a virtual afterlife upload portal where digital traces and memories could be crowdsourced and uploaded by friends and loved ones to a digital vault, a kind of black box stored in the cloud for posterity. We would say that if we want healthier cities, we better rethink our relationship to death, that burial and cremation as we know them are really dead practices. So here we advocated for new, cleaner, socially productive disposition alternatives that atomize into urban and digital realms. This funeral home and disposition site argued for the presence of ceremony and death in daily urban life and in the domestic. It was designed to accommodate the disposition of all of your substances, the tangible, the virtual, perhaps the immaterial, in coordination with existing religious and cultural ceremonies local to each context in which it might locate. A central actor in our proposals in the design of death is a process for remains disposal called alkaline hydrolysis. This process has long been used in biology labs and in agricultural sites for material disposition, but has recently caught on as a potential alternative to cremation and burial. Here you're seeing various available models for human alkaline hydrolysis, which is also called liquid cremation. And advocates for this process point to its low energy intensity, low carbon dioxide emissions relative to the combustion of cremation, and also to the potential utility of byproducts and waste fluids, which hold fertile properties and redistributable heat. In Seoul, an alkaline hydrolysis machine loaned by a company called Supreme Thermal Instrument provided us with the opportunity to bring spaces for remains processing and ceremony back to the city center and the domestic realm, which is really often where funeral and mourning, usually a 3-day social event, was centered in 19th and 20th century Korea. Our machine was at the courtyard center, shrouded by this gold curtain that you're seeing here, and its fertile fluid remains were collected and redistributed toward the ceremonial space frame floating above the home, fertilizing a suspended memorial garden, which was designed by the deceased or their loved ones, which could be monitored by live feed from home, and then the plants collected weeks later and transplanted elsewhere. The full-scale prototype now lives at the MMCA Museum in Seoul, which acquired it following the conclusion of the Biennale. Throughout our work on self-design and death, though, we began to notice that fitness was a recurrent actor that we kept encountering in our research. Exercise, it seemed, was often called on as an act of ritual and preservation, both historically and in the current moment, when folks encountered their own mortality in some way. In Rome, at the Spanish Academy, we had the chance to materialize that idea in a public exercise platform in the Piazza di San Pietro in Montorio. In this case, the pavilion Refresh Renew reflected on the construction of the body through fitness as a project of memorialization and as a project of life extension or eternalization, both biologically and digitally. A conceptual touchstone for us in this line of thought has always been the catalog of Lisa Taylor and Hans Hollein's Man Transforms exhibition, which was the inaugural show at the Cooper Hewitt Museum in 1976. And in the show, they asserted that there are mainly two fields of man's activity: to survive during life and to survive after life. The reason we engage design is, according to Hans Hollein, to live and to die, and possibly to live beyond death, which we think describes today one of the tech industry's key aspirations for the virtual afterlife, and also the persistence of life's digital remains after the point of our biological expiration. A structuring cloud diagram for Taylor and Hollein's exhibition, which you can see here, featured the central figure of the body, and among the few interrelated subjects that orbited it were redesigning the man, bodybuilding, and death, which kind of encapsulates all of our favorite subjects at Common Accounts. The research developed by my co-director Igor Bragado during his fellowship at the Spanish Academy included a survey of Baroque funerary catafalques and also funerary parades, which often rendered the deceased, who might have otherwise been absent or invisible, as an enlarged spatial urban spectacle. This also afforded us an opportunity to identify links to other moments in time where fitness reemerges in ritualistic contact with the demise of the body. Athletics and sport, common occurrences in Etruscan funerals, for instance, can still occasionally be found in similar contexts today. Our project was a prototype for a small funerary fitness catafalque that could also be scaled up as a centralized digital body imaging tower, modeled here. The pavilion was comprised of a yoga ball canopy, an open platform, exercise equipment, and a server vault that would log the recording of one's own self-construction, in other words, gym selfies, on site. Persistent in our work is the use of ready-made slogans as signs or fuzzy billboards, which we use in order to make visible a situation's programming and maybe attitude as well. Here you see a drawing we developed as a visual fitness manual to help visitors plan their regimen on site. And the pavilion was later adapted and installed at the Azkuna Zentroa Cultural Center in Bilbao in the Basque Country at the end of 2021, and installed this time as a canopy in the lobby of the building. When it was hung here, it was really reinstantiated as a hanging structure under which the public could walk, and it could be seen also from above from the neighboring galleries. And this view allows us to kind of dig into a trope incorporated into many of our installations, which is pattern making as a narrative device. So here you see a meat fiber pattern in black and white, which is a reference to Swiss historian Siegfried Gideon's attention to the material business of death, which was elaborated in the chapter on death in his 1946 book, Mechanization Takes Command. The pattern that we painted was actually adapted from an unused design for the cover of that book, which we found at the ETH University archive. It was commissioned by Gideon to the Greek architect Stamo Papadaki, but it was never used because it got delayed in the mail and simply missed the deadline for printing. Perhaps fittingly, our project in Rome was scanned and recorded digitally in its original location by the all-seeing satellites of Google Earth, extending the life of this structure, at least for now, in a digital twin of Rome's Janiculum Hill. As you can see, only a stone's throw from Bramante's Tempietto, which is itself a catafalque too. And all of this reminds us that where there are clicks and bytes, there's also brick and mortar. And all of this is really the springboard from which our League Prize installation launches. In You Are Well Liked in Your Community, we explore the macroscopic and also ritual aspects of online death as we imagine bridges between the physical and the virtual. So in the exhibition, you'll encounter an LED sign exhibiting death care industry slogans, messages left by mourners in YouTube comments, and measures of data sets of internet users uploaded to Facebook's Hive storage, which we see as virtual bodies already sublimated to the cloud. In contrast, vessels containing fluid from alkaline hydrolysis multiply the symbolic forms the dead occupy in the space of this exhibition. As new technologies develop and social media become accidental cemeteries, You Are Well Liked in Your Community muses on the aesthetics of contemporary death and mourning practices and ventures toward death's reatomization into daily life. And if you're in Toronto, this installation is part of a larger show that examines death on online platforms, curated by Aaron Resnick. It's called Tumbling in Harness, and it's going to be hosted at the Art Museum of the University of Toronto well into July. So it's still open to see in person, as well as online at the Art League website. I'll lastly point to an upcoming exhibition set to open in 3 weeks at Intermedii, one of the programs within Madrid's Matadero Art Center. Clima Fitness is the name of the show, which we've conceived alongside curator Maite Borjabat, and which has been in development for nearly 2 years. It expands on our work on fitness by now examining mutualisms between the body and the planet, and it indulges our preoccupation with parades, trailer vehicles, and also fitness equipment as spatial infrastructure. We've designed an installation in a mix of those languages that will host sculpture, video, and performance, exploring those themes of the show, planetarity and the body, with works from Faisal Altoum Bozar, Itziar Barrio, Ibiye Camp, Irati Inaritza, and also Mary Magic. It'll remain open for a year, so if you're in Madrid in the next 12 months, I encourage you to visit. And if you're curious about any of these works or about any of the other projects that I didn't share tonight, please track us down on Instagram or visit commonaccounts.online for more information on all of our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miles. I think we can carry on with Lindsey and Zara.
Thanks. All right, give me just 1 second. Okay, is that showing okay? Okay. Okay. Well, first off, thank you to Miles for that wonderful presentation. We're excited to follow. So yeah, to start, Sarah and I would really just like to recognize that it's really an honor for us to be here, and we're super grateful to the Architecture League team, especially Rafi, Anne, Alicia, and the League Prize jury this year for supporting our work. It means a lot. And thank you to everyone who's watching today. We appreciate you taking some time out, and to our incredible friends, family, and colleagues who have supported us with all of their encouragement and patience. So yeah, we're excited for the discussion at the end. We're big fans of Common Accounts, so we see a lot of kind of affinities between our work. So looking forward to the discussion, and a big thank you in advance to Jose for moderating. So without further ado, our talk today is titled Two Individual, One Shared.
And we will start by sharing a bit about who we are as individuals before moving into our shared practice. So I'm Sarah Aziz. I'm an assistant professor of architecture at the University of New Mexico, and I'm based between Halifax, West Yorkshire in Northern England, and Albuquerque, New Mexico. So I'm interested in the space between indigeneity and invasiveness to understand amplified nationalisms and the militarized technologies of keeping people and things out. And I look at this across multiple scales: the human, non-human, state, and corporate. Just trying to understand, like, who came first, who's truly invasive, and how does architecture facilitate these conversations by playing into the politics of nostalgia, which we'll go into a little bit more shortly.
I'm Lindsey Krug. I'm an assistant professor of architecture at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and I'm based between Chicago, where I live, and Milwaukee, where I teach. Through the lens of the architectural user as a body in space, I look at ways design solidifies and reinforces taboos, hierarchies, and inequities into built form. Generally, I'm interested in the architectural myths that reify institutions of American democracy and capitalism, our discipline's canonical disinterest in bodily excesses, and widely speaking, spatial foibles, both good and bad.
So to move over to the shed, Lindsey and I met in the spring of 2020 when we were both selected for the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's Fitzhugh Scott Architecture Fellowship. So the 9-month position requires fellows to each coordinate a large architecture studio, teach an elective, have an exhibition, produce an artifact, and be in Milwaukee. So Lindsey and I set up casual weekly Zoom calls to try and figure out how we can navigate our responsibilities, made more complicated by the global pandemic. We've not spent much time together in person, so we don't actually have any photos, but this drawing shows how we look together when we're on Zoom.
Sarah and I bonded over our shared interests and kind of underpinnings and theoretical frameworks, looking at the writing of, for example, Jack Halberstam's Low Theory, Barbara Penner's work on object obsolescence, and Paul Preciado's work on biopolitical sovereignty.
And we soon realized that, we took a trip in 2020 in the spring to New Harmony, Indiana, to visit my mentor and dear friend. It was for a potential commission that spiraled out of control, but we made 2 trips and they were really transformative.
Yeah. So Yeah, it wasn't until 2021 till the collaborations really took shape. And for some context, New Harmony is a historic Midwestern town with a population of around 600. It sits on the bank of the Wabash River along the border of Indiana and Illinois in the path of Tornado Alley and above the New Harmony fault line. It's undergone multiple waves of utopian experiments, purges, and ongoing catastrophic meteorological events. The latest attempt at utopia in the 1950s resulted in the commission of a Philip Johnson Church and a Richard Meyer Athenaeum. In 1964, eminent theologian Paul Tillich asserted the town's purpose is to create a new reality, conquering what is estranged and reuniting what belongs to each other. The more time we spent there, the more we understood this. For example, Dollar General came to New Harmony in 2019 and has done what all the failed utopian projects of the past haven't, to unite all people regardless of class and creed, something we'd observe while running to the store as our 2 trips coincided with our birthdays, something we'll return to later in the presentation.
And these trips to New Harmony and the lessons we've learned have really helped us clarify our respective interests. You know, when there, we'd often find ourselves returning to questions like, what would happen if architecture canonized overlooked building and typologies and places? Why does the American Midwest, which has 44 schools of architecture and 19 architectural fellowships, remain an unrecognized infrastructure for generating a coastal architectural discourse? And what are the architectural systems that help construct a nation's identity? And where do they originate? So in addition to this, we were thinking about how we might work together. We are 2 very different people with very different experiences. And as such, we're not always working on the same things. Still, the gift and the joys of reliable collaboration is priceless. And we love finding opportunities to work together. We don't have a firm, nor do we really see the need for one. We're 2 friends who are still figuring things out and appreciate the flexibility we have.
So for our lecture today, we'll share 3 projects with you, 2 individual and 1 shared. All of them question the spaces of national identity, the limits and lacks of the architectural canon, and use single architectural objects to trace the material geographies, associations, and legacies of a particular architectural phenomenon. And I'll start by introducing my project, Supreme Privacy. This project was born out of a fascination with a simple domestic object, the bed. However ubiquitous and often innocuous, the bed is also a site on which regimes of biopolitical power and control play out. And nowhere is this more clear than in the context of the US legal system and the Supreme Court. So as design manuals, like the one you're seeing here, architects' data proliferated worldwide in the post-war period, offering clear guidelines for nearly every spatial consideration and configuration. Other cultural currents against restriction and in favor of bodily freedom were moving through the nation's courts. In the landmark case of Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965, the psychological and physical space of marital privacy, arguably located in the bed, would take center stage in the fight to grant married couples the right to use contraception in the marital bedroom. And here a precedent was born, the right to privacy. The locating of a right to privacy in the Constitution as a constitutional right, in fact, was really radical for the justices in Griswold to claim, since the word privacy and its associated privileges never actually appear in the US Constitution. Instead, the justices wrote that their specific guarantees in the Bill of Rights have penumbras formed by emanations from those guarantees that help give them life and substance. Various guarantees create zones of privacy. Though Griswold would go on to be the foundational precedent in the ongoing fight for agency over one's body in America, including winning the right to abortion in Roe and the right to same-sex marriage in Obergefell, this lineage's reliance on this slippery term, privacy, is a lesser told story. Exceedingly spatial in his description of these penumbral zones that Justice Douglas gave, the question remains, where do these zones of privacy exist spatially and how are they occupied? How can we characterize the role of architecture, past and present, as good or bad, antagonistic or protective, and as an active player in this discourse? So using digital modeling and imaging tools, Supreme Privacy assembles and then excavates material from a lineage of 7 Supreme Court cases from 1965, which was Griswold, to 2022, concluding with Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health. to establish a cohesive visual language through which we can speculate on how law and architecture together have and may continue to define the extents of our private interior lives. What remains here, once the 7 spaces have been cored through, is a 5-foot wide cylindrical boring sample that reveals layering of enclosure, furnishings, signage, and other architectural detailing. And together they construct a kind of non-Cartesian roadmap through the piecemeal layout of spatial privacy rights in America. The unifying cut through both domestic spaces, offices, planes, clinics, lecture halls, etc., joins the spaces not by typological or aesthetic architectural qualities, but instead by the spatial precedent they establish together. Supreme privacy reveals the realities of the spaces where really momentous events have taken place and brings them back into the conversation, giving them agency. Generally lost to complex legalese and situated outside the discipline of architecture, the project seeks to rehumanize these cases using architectural tools, synthesizing the lives of these plaintiffs with their respective contexts, rooms, and everyday objects.
And with that, I'm going to share the second project. And it came about as I was trying to understand what it means to be British Pakistani and considered be from a lineage of people who are categorized as invasive in the country that they call home. And a space that British Pakistanis have never really had any claim to is a quintessential British holiday. So I started by researching its origins. And I came across the Victorian bathing machine, a horse-drawn cart with a crinoline hood that allowed affluent bathers to retain their modesty while enjoying the restorative properties of the sea. The huts unintentionally encouraged voyeurism, and in 2020, I tried to recreate a mock bathing machine from a satirical postcard. Didn't quite work out, but it ended up being a great social distancing machine. So I went back and did more research, which led me to the holiday camp impresario, Sir Billy Butlin, who between 1931 to his retirement in 1968, designed and built 9 eponymous holiday camps in the UK that once again made leisure a subject of national importance. His maxim and business model, a week's holiday for a week's pay, gave working people the chance to role-play the lives of the rich and famous in the miniature world of the camp. And less well known is the fact that Butlin built 3 of his camps in collaboration with the British military, who requisitioned them during the Second World War and converted them into training facilities. And it was in these moments, when the camp's function vacillated between leisure and militarism, that Butlin formed his signature style. Unremarkable buildings with remarkable interiors simulating foreign environments. And the interior landscapes of the camps offered sanitized and nostalgic renditions of Commonwealth nations, for which he inverted, then supplanted the maxim of existing state-sponsored leisure regimes by demonstrating that culture is no longer rooted in place. There aren't many drawings that remain of the pre and interwar holiday camps and post-war holiday camps. So the way that I'm trying to unpack the history and the architectural apparatus that facilitated this production of an ethno-nationalist agenda is by taking contemporary photographs and reconstructing them through drawing. And Butlin constantly challenged the provenance and significance of different architectural styles by creating antithetical pairings, such as modernist shells with horror vacui innards and Art Deco furniture in Art Nouveau rooms. His derisive architectural compositions affirmed Britain's dominance by propagating a sense of Englishness that was isolationist and idealistic. And many of his camp's communal bars and restaurants have been counterfeited and resituated in contemporary British holiday destinations, such as Benidorm and Magaluf in Spain. And I'm particularly fascinated by Butlinist propensity to forge and transpose the spatial and behavioral strategies from a pre-1970s camps onto foreign environments, such as Spain and in Greece, and how, in doing so, the camp propagates, the landscape dematerializes, and Brits now become invasive in the places they holiday.
So for our final project, The Shared, we have to return to New Harmony, where we began. We mentioned that we both happened to spend our birthdays there in the spring of 2021.
And we kept finding ourselves at the only dollar store in town, buying food, gifts, decorations, particularly as many of the major New Harmony attractions remained closed because of the pandemic. And in many ways, the relationship between Dollar General and the rest of the fabric of New Harmony, with these iconic structures that signify pride to some and immense violence to others, this relationship embodies the complexities of a contemporary Harmonite community.
And while Dollar General was there, at least latent all along for Sarah, me and Sarah, only once we started looking into it further and really initially out of a kind of naive curiosity, did we really kind of come to terms with how massive, impactful, and frankly extraordinary this corporation is. So it has over 19,100 stores in the US, making Dollar General by far the largest small box retailer. And we should note that we made this map almost 2 years ago, so there should be at least 1,000 more points plotted here.
And while it's primarily an American retailer with just a few stores in Mexico, the global infrastructures are in place to keep a company like Dollar General running are astonishing. Its products, namely small home goods, gifts, and basic necessities, almost all come from Yiwu, a city of about 1.2 million people in the Zhejiang province of China. And located in Yiwu is a Fusion market, the world's largest wholesale small commodities marketplace.
Since the first stalls of this market opened in the early 80s, its success has made the city of Yiwu an attractive location for Chinese workers and families looking for economic opportunity. Setting up small-scale domestic factories and production spaces, each usually focused on the creation of a single good, like you're seeing here. Millions have migrated to Yiwu to reap the economic benefits, despite, as you also see, the often harsh conditions that are produced in these ad hoc production spaces.
And inevitably, Yiwu has earned the moniker, the city where Christmas is made and sold, as a vast majority of seasonal decor, largely headed for America, is produced and sold at the Future market. And this reality, where spaces of production are worlds away from those who end up consuming these goods, or even subscribing to a religious denomination, produces incomprehensibly large life cycle maps for an object as simple and asinine as a small plastic Santa Claus.
So this brings us back to some of the questions that Sarah and I have found ourselves asking over and over, as we introduced a little earlier. Like, for example, what would happen if architecture canonized overlooked building typologies and places? What systems have enabled this invasion of the dollar store empire? And what does it mean for architecture to contribute to the constructing of a nation's identity at home and abroad? Here you're seeing some stills on the screen from a film called Bookland that takes viewers inside the Fujian market.
So the way that we try and work through these questions, as they relate specifically to Dollar General Corp and its presence in the American Midwest, where New Harmony is situated, as we observed there and in the cities we've lived within the region, we try and speculate and imagine alternative realities for the future of these stores.
So, in thinking about how to reimagine or repurpose an infrastructure with over 19,000 nodes, we always are needing to think through the potential outcomes, which inevitably can be both good and bad, serious and lighthearted.
And this takes us to Dollar House Dreams, work that we developed as part of our League Prize exhibition. Here we look to the history of paper architecture, which in the spirit of a dollar store offers a low stakes, low budget means to quickly test and prototype, with the potential to create a product that can sell alongside other paper goods and stocked in Dollar Generals across the nation.
Dollar House Dreams proposes to turn Dollar General stores in the Midwest into museums for housing the unrealized architectural ambitions of its architects, designers, and building enthusiasts. The project studies the dollar store phenomenon across these flyover states, which have long served as an essential but under-recognized infrastructure for a coastal architecture discipline.
And like the dollar store, these areas are often rendered invisible or reductively monolithic, rather than what they are, which is nuanced and extraordinary. So how might the perception, function, and influence of Dollar General change when it moves into some of the Midwest's most mundane yet iconic architectures, such as a Foxconn Dome, the US's first mosque, which is in Iowa, a Tempur-Sealy mattress factory, New Deal public school buildings, grain silos, or the Grand Castle apartments?
So utilizing photos, projections, models, and AI image generation tools, Sarah and I staged different iterations of these Dollar General museums, working from the scale of the object to the scale of the store and its layouts.
And the project walks the wobbly line between artificiality and reality. And it asks viewers to confront their architectural biases and discomforts as a copy-paste language of a dollar store is put in dialogue with venerated building types. And we also wonder, how this work builds on the legacies of revered architects like James Wines and his Best Stores and Arato Isazaki's supermarkets. And lastly, we want to thank the Massachusetts Museum of Art and Assets for Artists and ArtOmi, as all of the images, most of the images were produced during their respective residency programs.
So to conclude, before we thank you all for watching our presentation, really in all of our work, Sarah and I try to find and reunite the overlooked spaces and architectural systems that are estranged from the nations and ideologies that they help produce and maintain. For example, American identity lies in the Constitution, yet the areas that underscore these principles, areas as small or kind of mundane as a bed, Planned Parenthood, etc., are supplanted by neoclassical courthouses. British holiday camps remain understudied, but are unparalleled in their ability to abstract architecture from its harsh material reality and repackage it as a system for nationalist myth-making. And the humble dollar store, a place where Americana domesticity is manufactured in rural China and then imported and consumed by rural America. And with that, we will thank you all, and we look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Lindsey, Sarah, Miles, for this amazing set of presentations. I personally didn't know your work before looking at it and studying it with a Architectural League committee, and I must say I'm highly impressed by the strength of your guys' work. So first of all, well, I would like to remind everyone to please type down if you have any questions for Lindsey, Sarah, or Miles. Just write it down, and I will read them for them. And the point right now is to start a conversation. So, Lindsey, you just said that you found some similarities between your preoccupations and Miles and Common Accounts work. Could you tell us what are the similarities you found, and so that, and Miles, also this question goes for you. I think I would be interested in looking at the bridges between your guys' way of thinking.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the question, Jose. Yeah, I think there's a number of ways I see connections between the work that Sarah and I do, both together and independently, and the work of Igor and Miles. I think for one, and I was kind of remembering it as Miles, you were talking today, is just even through the way of presenting, like a real emphasis on narrative and beginning architectural stories or ambitions from whether it's a single person, a single community, a single, just something as simple as a story. And I really appreciate that. And it's a way that I like to work as well. A small, maybe personal affinity is, I also did a master's thesis on the topic of death and the kind of taboos around it, and kind of obsession with the different options or not that are available to people in end of life, and the way that even in death, the so-called great equalizer, there's all of these kind of divisions that we force upon people, whether it's by religion or economic status and so on. So I appreciate the delving into that topic specifically. But yeah, maybe I'll open it up.
Lindsey, that's amazing. I should have known that you were a death person. I feel like we always find each other. It was so amazing to see your work, Sarah and Lindsey. And I mean, I also couldn't help but think about the very specific reality of running a remote practice where your partner is always at a kind of distance, and maybe what that looks like on a kind of day-to-day, and the sort of the way that design labor has to kind of shapeshift in order to nurture that relationship, but also facilitate that kind of remote conversation. And yeah, I noticed as well that your projects are so so well kind of founded on this like long form, almost journalism, kind of documentation and storytelling that really kind of sets the scene for maybe an intervention, maybe the kind of storytelling becomes intervention. But that's something that certainly resonates with us in our work. And it was such a treat to see that play out in those 3 projects of yours.
I don't know, Sarah, if you would like to add anything to this, or you want me to take
Sure.
from there?
Sorry, I didn't add anything to say, I didn't know. But yeah, I just want to say it's such a privilege to be in this space and to have a conversation with all of you and to follow your work, Miles and Igor's. I think one thing that I really, really enjoyed as well is like the forcefulness of some of the strategies that you're suggesting as an alternative to practices that are completely obsolete and unsustainable, like the forcing of, I guess not forcing, maybe that's too strong of a word, but the like inculcating bodily fluids and excess after death into everyday rituals, and how that transition can occur, that transformations in people's imagination, understanding, and lastly, how you're engaging topics of nostalgia, and in particular through the Facebook digital archive, how it's flattening the son's identity and how it's distorting the relationship between him and his father, and how that's emphasized by the backdrop that's changing to this fitness regime. I found that pretty fascinating and parallels.
It's really lovely to hear that. One thing that I also thought in sort of seeing your work was in how hard it is to propose anything stranger than the kind of realities that you encounter in your research and documentation. And I could see that kind of like living and breathing in your work. So it's really nice to kind of share that as well.
Awesome. So yeah, you have this in common, that you have this remote practice condition with like in between yourselves. So how does that, you think, I don't know, leads on the questions behind the experience of working with architecture or with design, or with, I don't know if the word is even architecture anymore, because we're talking about how architecture is a tool for changing society or changing the way we think about the space we live in, right? But being in the distance, how does that actually work for you? In particularly in your case, Miles, where you have these pavilions. I'm sure that you and Igor worked in the distance, but then you guys went to the pavilions and both got to live through the experience. And my question would be, what was the reaction of the audiences? Like, could you get to see how the audience interacted with your installations? And also that question goes for Lindsey and Sarah with a dollar store interventions that you've made. Like, how does the audience react? How does your questions come through your pavilions to the audiences, to the people going into them? I don't know.
Yeah. In the case of the pavilion in Seoul, which was sort of our first, we in the setup while we were sort of building that, we were meeting with a number of officials in the city in order to sort of further our like understanding of the context in which this thing was locating, and as well to kind of layer in important realities or context into the work. We had one meeting with at the time, the deputy urban planner or architect of the city of Seoul. And the only thing we really knew about him was that his father had recently died, and that he, we were a little apprehensive about the topic and basically showing him these, kind of solution-y sort of technologies for death and sort of managing death-related issues in cities like Seoul. And so, I mean, maybe that would be the sort of most kind of prolonged encounter that we had with a kind of, not a visitor to the pavilion, but a visitor with our research on death and some of the kind of proposals that we had been making in sort of paper form before actually building it. And, you know, we were sort of surprised, but encouraged by his, I think, positive response to this. You know, his reaction was like, yeah, I just tried to organize a funeral here. It was extremely difficult. Maybe some of these could be sort of useful means by which we can kind of expand access to death care. You know, I think in the case of Rome with Refresh Renew, I'm not sure if I wasn't there for after the installation. I was there for the construction of it. And I don't know if anyone actually worked out on it. I hope that they did. But I love that it's sort of digitally rendered now in Google Earth. Maybe not for posterity, but for the next little while. And I see that as a kind of encounter with it, kind of at the project's like core essence of sort of multiplying, you know, where there's like Rome's basalt cobblestones, there's also like the clicks and bytes of the internet.
Yeah, well, of course, it's interesting to see the effect of these pavilions on people, or these experiences on third parties, particularly with your work, Lindsey and Sarah. I love the COVID dress. Like, I don't know how much that performance of the using that long skirt actually went ongoing. I would love to see some videos of your work, because I could see a lot of images. But I believe some of the true experience behind what you are proposing actually could only be seen through the experience of living them. So how was that? How was that experience of the COVID dress, and how the people react, or even the users? Like, how was that experience?
So I actually made that in New Harmony, Indiana, on a separate trip, and that was really like in the heart of the pandemic. And you know, it was a somewhat frivolous exercise in trying to understand the dimensions and the material reality of the Victorian bathing machine. But when I made it, and I was with Ben Nicholson, he found someone to model it, and we walked it down the streets of New Harmony. It was pretty remarkable to see just how polarizing it was. Like, people were either enchanted by it, thought it was really novel and humorous and, you know, pretty one-dimensional, which it was, but other people were reviled. Like, they thought it was the most like audacious act of like displaying one's political allegiance. You know, I got a lot of shouts like, go home, go home. But it's pretty funny, because the people who were shouting go home are actually descendants from where I'm from in the UK, it turns out. So I don't know, there's like that weird, but that's a tangent. So what we didn't show was some evolutions of the dress that ended up responding to some of the vitriol, and trying to figure out how to use some of the language of the people who were so opposed to it, the visual language, and then recreate it so the dress can camouflage. So one iteration was made with Natalie Cure, that was just a giant grass dress. So the idea was you could just recede into the dress and camouflage if anyone was going to give you a hard time. So there have been some difficult encounters. I think what's important about Dollar General is that all of the public projects that we've done with it, they've all started from outsourcing. Like, we've had like one of my research assistants called every single Dollar General in Wisconsin and spoke to someone who works there and asked them for their opinion on a piece of stock that's most important to them in their respective communities. And then that's how we then built the exhibition. So I think the familiarity of Dollar General also makes it a really important tool for thinking critically about architecture, because it doesn't become this completely incomprehensible, detached thing that no one can conceptualize or imagine, like, I don't know, like a Starchitect library in their town, what impact that could have. But because it's Dollar General, you can actually have a pretty robust conversation about what the effects might be.
Yeah, that's I think amazing about your work, because many of the things that you observe or that you look into could actually modify many things in the behavior of people. It's not like this architecture with capital A. It's like small actions that can actually detonate strong changes in the cultural behavior of a society. So I really love that of your work. And I'm going to read a question from the audience that says, I was struck by how powerful the borehole peephole concept was in communicating Lindsey and Sarah's timeline of the bedroom's legal development. Could you speak to how that was first generated during your creative process? So this was by Dan Jacks, and he'll be thankful if you can answer to that. And then I'll carry on with some other questions.
Sure. Thank you, Dan, for the question. Yeah, I think one of the main reactions I get to the Supreme Privacy project and work in the images is this a strong reaction to the mode of viewing that as someone receiving the work, you're kind of forced. You're almost all of them, right? You're the outside looking in. It's voyeuristic, it's invasive, and there's a kind of discomfort to throw it back to the theme of this year, just in confronting. I don't know. There's something that happens where you're like, all I'm looking at is a kind of banal space, whether it's the post office or the lecture hall. Nothing jarring about it, but because of the framework of the project, and when you kind of peel back the layers and know what happened there, even though it started as kind of a normal day in the life for the plaintiffs and the other people involved, it spirals out of control, and the court case really has the ability to kind of upend people's lives. So the origin of the project and the work, like, it dates back, I don't know, to not that long, but long. So it's a little like 7 years or something to back when I was in school. And I think it was maybe the moment in my education where you realize that a lot of the things you've been given are just, there's these like glaring things that no one ever wanted to point out for it. So in the case of Neufert, is like just the ridiculous gendered depictions of people and the measurements on bodies that are in that book. And yes, it's been amended, but these editions, they last and they endure. And whether you were given the PDF of the 3rd edition from 1970 or the latest one, there's these things where it's you realize the kind of way that your profession or the profession you want to be a part of has like distilled space and the bodies inside of it down. So the bed, the kind of interest or inquiry into it, we emerged from just reading the language of Neufert, which I had a quote on one of the slides. It just talks about people's comfort in where the bed is positioned in their room. And it's such a sweeping statement. And I think what struck me was that privacy, the bed in the context of privacy again is this kind of innocuous term. But the reason it's such a slippery slope is that privacy will also get weaponized in legal instances by people who are being accused of whether it's assault or abuse, that it gets weaponized the other way of like, this is something happening in my personal private life. It's not the business of an outsider. So there's something that's very loaded about the bed, again depicted so almost cartoonish, lighthearted, but it became this kind of like tool or like through line to kind of dig into these legal cases that I otherwise couldn't fully wrap my head around, except for tying it to a kind of piece of furniture in this case.
Thank you, Lindsey, and thank you, Dan, for the question. That piece of work reminded me of Gordon Matta Clark's installation where he actually broke through buildings, because this was a digital Photoshop image, and then you made the 3D modeling, right? But it's actually very interesting to think about all the layers that happen between the public and the private in architecture through history. So I think it's I also love how every project you've shown not only has a story or a narrative, but it has a strong research on social or I don't know, ethical and legal and all kinds of human issues. So that's something that you guys have in common in your work, particularly Miles, I think, well, your work with common accounts is mind-blowing. I think that what you guys are proposing with these machines or instruments that aim to redefine the way we think about death or exercise or health, the role of architecture in molding those human activities and giving new forms to them, I think it's fantastic. So I was very intrigued on how the audience would interact. I would love to go to one of these pieces and actually see how they make you feel, because that would be probably my next question before reading another comment here at the questions and answers section. I think we live in a time where we communicate through images, especially when looking at Salk's or Lindsey and Sarah's portfolio. It was this array of strong images showing us themes of discomfort and expressed in installations. But I would ask you, are you interested in physical architecture? Because most of what you showed, Lindsey and Sarah, was these like more graphic experiments or like these questions. But have you, other than I saw the dollar installation you made with all these plastics, but have you worked more with like physical interventions or you feel more comfortable expressing yourselves in the graphic media? Have you worked with both medias?
That's a really great question. I think it goes back to Miles's point about like what it means to engage subjects, but I mean, for lack of a better term, a taboo, and like what kind of engagement you get. I mean, Lindsey and I would love to realize these in a more conventional architectural format. But, you know, big question mark is like, who's going to fund our ideas? And we find ourselves like smacking our heads up against the screen every day, another grant that's failed 4 times in a row. So it's not that the ambition isn't there. It's just how like great, like with a demographic whose architecture we're engaging with and whose questions we're really grappling with, absolutely, there seems to be way more buy-in. But for the architectural institutions who we need to support us, less so. So yeah, it's a really, and yeah, not to put you on the spot, Miles, but I would love to see like how you've navigated this, because clearly you've been really successful.
I'm glad it looks that way. I think that, I mean, you know, a couple sort of simple things have helped us. Igor and I are in 2 different continents, and I think it helps us cover a lot of ground in engaging different sources of funding, engaging different contexts in which, you know, I think some of the projects that we produce with institutions or, you know, in Europe maybe aren't ones that we would produce in Toronto or Canada, and vice versa. I think as well, I mean, I think that's a big one. But as well, I think the other thing that we've done is lean into the kind of blurriness of our boundary with visual art and media art, and tried to really engage with exhibiting institutions and curators who might not typically commission architecture, but who have an interest in the lens and the subject matter that we're approaching. And in turn, that's forced us to adapt the work that we might produce to the gallery or to contexts in which a visitor might not arrive with the same language or architectural knowledge that we might otherwise assume. So I think that there is a certain amount of code switching as well when you're speaking with those different audiences and with those different contexts. I think we've also started to understand where the kind of intolerances lie. There's not always a lot of tolerance for architects cosplaying as visual artists in those spaces, and you know, the other way around maybe too. But I think learning to kind of speak those languages and to inhabit those spaces has maybe opened up other scales or spaces of work that we wouldn't typically have been invited to engage.
Yeah, and even though there was not much of a sensorial or explorational experience in your portfolio, Sarah and Lindsey, all the committee and the jury was like truly provoked by all the questions you raised behind your work, and I think that array of thought and it's really what keeps us moving, right? So I really celebrate that. I will read another comment and question by Corinne Newville. She says, amazing work, everyone. Thank you. I am also a deaf person. Lindsey, you said death has divisions of people, even though death is an equalizer. Miles, do you see digital funerals inclusive, or will there be a division, or will there be divisions?
Lindsey, do you want to go first?
Yeah, maybe I'll just offer maybe a brief response. And maybe I will start maybe also by I'll quickly respond also to Jose, what you had put on the table before, and like this tension between, I don't know, speculation and research and storytelling and more maybe traditional manifestation of designers and architects in this kind of built form. And maybe yeah, I don't know, maybe the work that Sarah and I do, and I think Miles as well, like the way we look at things is, I don't know, maybe we set ourselves up for a bit of failure, right? Like it's like nothing, there's an impossibility to succeed when you kind of look with critique, whether it's like productive critique or even like whimsical, lighthearted critique at the world, right? There's a kind of insecurity of like, ooh, do I want to add to that? But like, you know, you never, like, hindsight's 2020. It's easy to look back at things and find patterns. But yeah, I think it produces this anxiety about like what it is that we do. I think maybe I wish there was a little bit more anxiety about it in the discipline of just like, I don't know, building can be so irresponsible. I don't know, it's an ethical question. So yeah, I don't know, the part of me is like, oh, of course I want to build something, but I don't know, it's challenging. But yeah, and then death, yeah, I don't know, maybe I put it as an equalizer. I would put it in air quotes because I think it's a mythical equalizing force. People die all sorts of different types of death, and you know, there's ways of, you know, there's, you know, theory, whose work I really, Russ Castronovo, writes about necro-citizenship and how you can die, you know, as a citizen, you die by, you know, not receiving the same kind of rights in society, or relegated second-class citizens. So yeah, I think maybe like my perception of death is also a little bit beyond just like the pure physical death, but all of the ways that you can be made dead in life. So yeah, but I actually love the prompt of like what the digital funeral offers in terms of like inclusivity. So I'll throw it over to you, Miles.
Sure. There will be divisions and stratifications, the same way that there are with material cemeteries now and in the past. You know, I think that they might be subtle, or maybe we might sort of be able to kind of mask or hide some of them. For instance, in the case of John Berlin, the video that he made, the plea video that went viral, he eventually monetized that video and allowed YouTube to put advertising on it in an effort to raise funds to cover the cost of the funeral for his son. And many people in the comments noticed and began to criticize him for that. And that shifted the temperature a little bit in the conversation and in the role and the kind of subject matter that comment feed was engaged with. And, you know, I think even seeing in the kind of YouTube videos the ways in which the family's economic fortunes also changed from the year before Jesse's death, from videos that were later uploaded, to the year later when they had moved into the mobile home in Arnold. There are ways in which that version of a kind of online mourning practice rendered more visible the stratifications or the differences economically, the reality economically that that family was experiencing. And, you know, the first question that comes to mind when we think about digital funerals or the virtual afterlife is, who gets to choose how long your files exist for, or when they're deleted, or you know, who owns them? And this is one of the kind of central issues, I suppose, with the prospect of for-profit social media platforms, you know, casually and who knows, maybe even irresponsibly hosting our kind of death practices, our funerary practices, and our mourning practices. It's not really what these sites were designed for. And although that, you know, they're making adaptations to try and accommodate these things that are happening, I think we could still wonder if ultimately a for-profit enterprise is the best place for us to host our funerals in perpetuity.
Thank you, Miles and Lindsey. Definitely a strong question. I think we need to be wrapping up. I would probably just like to add to, as a final thought or reflection, that I believe that the role of architecture is totally changing, and our role as designers and architects is also changing, and the digital era is here, and there's a whole room for us to deal with in this new space. That and I think your work is really outstanding, dwelling in these new opportunities. So I'm glad that you guys met, and I'm glad to meet you. And I will just leave the microphone to Anne to finish this up, and thank you very much for this amazing night.
Thank you all. And I mean, I think the ongoing questions that I think we'll see also tackled within the coming weeks about durability and place and presence, and the relationship between those in a kind of tangible way, but also the intangible world of the internet, and how that resonance plays out over time is just super fascinating. Next week's lectures, same time, same place, will be by Daisy Ames and Sean Canty. We'd like to thank you all for joining us and our speakers, and encourage everyone, please, to visit the installations and continue the conversation. Thank you.